when how to select which one is going to next. In that storage, we did talk a little bit about the principle of quanta or behind quantum. And there's an interesting thing that operating system designers have to consider when they think about the size or the length. Size of quanta is the proper word for it. For instance, you consider the following, this is the examples, not that important, but it's just important to say. What you see there are a process, a hypothetical process of, let's say, 10 time slices, whatever that means, of 10 items. And let's say consider currently the quanta which is described in the top scenario is, let's say, 12. That means the time quanta is bigger than the actual process. And that means when that process starts running on the CPU, there's no context switch necessarily ever, meaning it will voluntarily relinquish the CPU when it's finished, either going into the waiting queue or basically getting out of the system. And there's zero context switches for getting that process in and out and getting the new process in, basically. So you don't have to worry too much about in this case, because there's zero context switches in this case. In a case where we have a quantum of 6, for instance, same type of process, then this process will have at least 2 periods where it will be in the red queue. That means there's 2 context switches that you waste on the actual process itself. Sorry, 1 context switch that you waste on the process itself, and that means that you're wasting a little bit of CPU time in that total execution time of that CPU burst. And the last one basically explains a situation where the quanta is 1 unit and the length of the process or the CPU burst time is 10. Then effectively there's going to be 9 context switches in this case. Now that should just basically highlight that we don't want to have the quanta too small, because then you cumulatively add context switch overhead time to the total amount of time that we basically spend per process. So you want to get some kind of middle ground. Now, you can actually read the textbook. They for instance mentioned that about 80% of all CPU bursts, that's the kind of rule of thumb that operating system designers work with, is that 80% of CPU bursts should be less than the actual time quantity. Say that when we look at a typical CPU process, 80% of its time should, the CPU burst itself should not require multiple context switches to go back into the system. That's kind of what they're trying to work at. And that kind of makes sense. If you go back to one of the first diagrams that we had here, it showed in most processes actually spends, most processes have a very short bursts of CPU time in the full duration of the actual process. There's a very few of them where the burst times actually go a lot longer. So that kind of makes sense why that rule of thumb is actually used. Also of interest is that modern operating systems, the quanta typically ranges from between 10 and 100 milliseconds. That's kind of what they work on. Where your typical context switch takes about 10 microseconds. That's how fast it normally takes. And obviously, the faster the CPU's clock cycles become, the faster, the smaller that size actually gets. So that just shows you that typically the context switch time is very, very small, and it's normally not something that we have to be concerned too much about. However, the size of the quanta is something that we need to think about when we design operating systems. That's why normally it is part of the policy component of the operating system, not so much the mechanism. We've historically talked about the policy versus mechanism. It's 2 principles. In this case, the setting of the time quanta is the policy aspect, meaning we can potentially change it if necessary. Right, so the rest is really just, you can read through this, it's not that important. This is also not very important. We also talked about this principle yesterday. You get the principle of what they call multi-level queues. That means that you're sure you have a ready queue, but you can potentially break up the ready queue into different types of queues. And you can have processes that's in the foreground on a dedicated queue, and you can have processes that, for instance, running as batch jobs in some kind of background queue. You can actually handle the scheduling separately between these different queues. And we've also seen where, specifically with different priorities of processes, that it kind of infers that you actually have different queues as well. For instance, a queue with a priority 1, queue with a priority 2, queue, and so on and so on. Because that kind of groups your processes together. Right, so that's really not, just take note, it's for interest or for, just for note. And some of them do give feedback where some queues have different size quanta, so that you can eventually make sure that they finally continue and execute. This brings us to, again, just a quick mention about thread scheduling. Now, thread scheduling is an interesting phenomenon. Now, if you can remember back, you get different models of managing threads. You get what they call the one-to-one. So that means one user thread gets mapped against one kernel thread, and then the next user thread gets mapped to a separate kernel thread. So there's a one-to-one correlation between user and kernel. And in that case, there is only one scheduler that will affect all the threads in that situation. That's the scheduler that runs as part of the kernel. However, you can implement a separate scheduler running in the user runtime environment. So for instance, the Java runtime or the Java virtual machine can effectively run its own scheduler. And depending on the number of threads that you have in the Java runtime machine, it can do its own scheduling there. So what they mentioned there is you get what they call process contention scopes or system contention scopes. And that basically just means that when you look at the threads, who do they contend with regards to getting CPU time? On a, as you can actually see here, the many-to-one or the many models, and you've got a lot of user-level threads, and there's a disconnect between the number of user-level threads and the kernel-level threads, you can potentially have a user-level scheduler running, and then they basically contend within the same process. Well, they fight against each other, kind of, to get processing time. In other cases, where you have the one-to-one relationship, or if you just purely look at the kernel threads itself, there you get what they call system contention scope, meaning that all the threads that's on the system, they fight for effectively CPU time. So just take note of those two terms. This is just for reading books. You can read through this. It's not that important. This brings me to the following principle. So far, the examples that we've used, we've said that we've got a queue. So when we think of this stairs as a queue, and here I've got the scheduler, and the scheduler selects who's actually going to get some CPU time. Now that's a very naive approach if you consider that we can have multiple processors. How does the scheduler pick a process, and how do they decide which processor it can run on? So it's not just giving it and say, okay, you can run. There's also a decision on which processor must it run on, or which core it must run on. Now you get what they call homogeneous processors, or so homogeneous processors are within the multiprocessor environment. That means they all do the same. But when we look at the scheduling, you get what they call asymmetric multiprocessing or symmetric multiprocessing. Now, what's the difference? With asymmetric multiprocessing, that basically means you run the scheduler on one CPU, and on that one CPU itself contains